Colin, what would you think of as the most interesting doctoral thesis you supervised? Out of the different subject matter you covered, what was the most interesting one?
There's a big difference between difficult and interesting.
I understand exactly why I
Probably the most
posed it.
interesting was Chuck Vita's one on transportation in the Arctic, and the technical parts of it and things were very interesting, but the bigger picture was fascinating.
And what made it such a challenge?
Because I didn't realise the problems that existed. He just made it. He put, from his own professional work, he did this in the spare time.
Right.
And so this was the professional work he was doing.
And made it able to convert it to a dissertation
yes,
subject.
And a couple of very distinguished papers. In another case when I no way could have been a party to the
Fair enough.
published work. No way. I brought something to it, but it was much more of a critical vein than a contributory vein in the sense of doing things
Chuck's
useful.
a very fine engineer.
I gather he's an outstanding engineer, Chuck Vita. Yeah. But that was fun. I mean, completely new to me, that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
One of either your last or next to last doctoral colleague was Tom Boothby, who's now on the faculty at Penn State. Now, Tom brings a very interesting dimension to the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well,
tell us a little about that.
Tom came here, shall we say, as a rather older graduate student. I have no idea how old he was, but he was certainly 10 years older than most of them we saw. He'd been practicing as an architect for a number of years. He had a master's degree in structural engineering from Washington University in St. Louis with Ted Columbus. And
that was before he moved up to... No, where did he move from? He'd moved from there to Minneapolis, didn't he?
No, Ted, yes.
Yeah.
Ted went up
Yeah,
to go to Minneapolis from Washington University in St. Louis. And he looked so good on paper, Tom Boothby. He scored 800 on all the GRE stuff, and apparently could write, apparently could do sums and things like that. And he came, and I found he was an outstanding applied mathematician.
Okay.
And then, I mean, this is so unusual. I advised him that he probably shouldn't get a doctorate because I didn't think he'd get a job.
Colin, your first paper while you were still in Victoria was on structural safety, and that's influenced your professional approach to many things over the years. And in some ways, that partly influenced your establishing of the journal Civil Engineering Systems with Ian Munro in 1983. The main objective, what were you hoping to achieve with the journal?
Probably it was a consequence of that year that Munro spent at Berkeley when he got involved in things which appeared to have very little to do with civil engineering, but which you find out are very valuable in civil engineering. And then you find out that other people in civil engineering, in other fields, transportation, are doing things which you reinvent in your own field. What we were looking for was to provide a venue for material which people could place and show the generic value of within the profession.
Right.
And I think we were completely clear in our minds. This reinventing the wheel was not a good use of professional time.
But there's a thing we've run up against in that folks have gotten a little narrower rather than broader in view, which makes it hard.
I don't think it's been a great success in that respect. I think it's a genuine effort, but I don't believe it's worked out terribly well in that
Ian's
respect.
untimely death in 1985 certainly influences that, because the two of you could spark on in ways that might have taken different directions.
That's correct, and he also had so much influence in Europe that
it's harder to have that from the United States.
Yes, quite.
I understand fully.
Yes.
One of the things that you and I were first involved in 1971 in a course on a systems approach to engineering and environmental issues in particular. And it's been a hope of mine, and it troubles me that we haven't achieved this. But the way I see civil engineering now with an environmental context is the provision of societal infrastructure in a human-influenced ecosystem context. And I don't think we're doing a good enough job there. And there are 6 billion of us on the planet. And we have to pay attention to that. So I thought the journal would have been able to try and pull some of that, but for whatever reason, people are not quite ready there. Over the years, you've gotten me to read all kinds of things, and one book that I really appreciate you getting me to read was Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers.
Well, the last part was, to me, very impressive.
Well,
I mean, the whole book was impressive, but that last part was remarkable. He put his finger on generation changes.
The big change was the women and men who liberated Europe, starting with the Normandy Invasion in 1944. And it turns out that you and I have been the beneficiaries of those people who survived, came back and led this country.
Yep.
And they've put in the institutions in place that's made us possible to do our work. You and I also grew up, or in younger life, under the threat of nuclear holocaust.
Yes.
This was a concern to everybody. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the things that have influenced in your lifetime, and incidentally, we're enormously grateful to those people who made it possible for us to live in peace. But just thinking back in things that have happened in the last century that have a huge influence, that influence families you knew, the 1918 killer flu, the influenza epidemic, there were roughly 40 million deaths from that.
Something of that order, yes. Yeah.
In World War II, there are estimated 60 million lives lost, something like that. I don't know for sure the numbers. But when we were chatting, preparing for this, you mentioned that there's hardly a family that you know in England that didn't lose somebody
in the flu.
In that flu epidemic.
No doubt about it.
So here we are, and there are things that are beyond our control that influence us, that make it possible for us to do our work in the setting. And we can get a little complacent, I think, if we're not careful.
Well, it's the best of all worlds that you don't go through the carnage of war.
Agreed.
I understand that, and it's also the best of worlds that you don't have epidemic raging or pandemic. But you mustn't be complacent.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And when we think about the second major outbreak of Black Death bubonic plague, 1347, about a third of the population of Europe taken out.
That's right.
That gives you a different set of constraints to think about.
Yes, it changed society.
Changes the whole game.
Yeah.